Okay, so we start with chapter 9 today, which deals with government policy vis-a-vis market competition. It's a chapter 9 in your book, very well written, so read it. It's government policy and competition. As a way of reminding you, just wanted to say that last time we analyzed to some degree some major theories or models of free market competition. We wanted to understand what is happening on a free market and how firms compete in the market in the absence of government intervention. What is the nature of competition? What kinds of competition exist? And what are the usual models that are used by economists to understand the economic process? We've seen that there are two main models of competition: the perfectly competitive market or perfect competition, or price taker model, and the price searcher model. They describe in different ways competition in static conditions, in the conditions when the environment within which competitive process unfolds doesn't change, or changes very little, to a very limited degree. And we also see that there is a dynamic competition, which changes the parameters of the situation, which changes the environment within which the competitive process unfolds, and we call that the creative destruction process, within which technology changes, products change, dynamic competition or creative destruction. That's the third form. And this third way of looking at competition is more realistic and more describes a lot more than the previous two, but that nevertheless there are certain reasons why these textbook models, number 1 and number 2, are also useful for certain purposes. Now, one of the problems with these models, with all economic models, is that sometimes people start taking them too seriously. That instead of, you will remember the perfectly competitive model or price taker model, you will remember these 6 or 7 conditions or 6 or 7 principles that we laid out, and that all of them or most of them or many of them are unrealistic in a sense, that they do not correspond to what we see in reality. Like firms are not always price takers, they sometimes change prices, that the firms do not always sell a homogeneous product, that the firms differentiate their products, that information about business opportunities is not always freely available, and so on. So just to revisit what we did last time, and you will see, and I warned you, that this is not a realistic description of reality, but nevertheless that the model has its purpose and its usefulness for a particular reason, to shed light on a certain problem of economics. Nevertheless, one of the key assumptions that are unrealistic, but that for some reason, by a let's say unhappy or unfortunate turn of events, economists came to believe in as a hallmark of real competition, was the idea that you need a large number of firms. So this was one of the ideas that the economists took from the perfect competition model. You will remember, if anyone remembers, why Frank Knight and the authors of the price taker model assume that there is a very large number of firms, like the thousands or millions of firms. They didn't want to say that really in every single competitive market you will have a large number of firms. They wanted to say, let's assume, because our purpose was to prove, to show that a competitive process which is not centrally directed can produce efficient economic results. That was the primary model of this perfectly competitive model. To show to socialists in 1920s and 1930s that you can devise a model of a free market economy which is an infinite number of firms that will allocate resources in an efficient way to serve the needs of customers, consumers. They said, let's make it as unfavorable for our case as possible. Let us assume not that 5 or 6 or 7 firms exist. Let's assume that there are millions of firms. Anyway, this decentralized market system based on free competition would equally well function even in these types of situations. So that was the limited purpose of this outlandish requirement that a competitive market will have a huge, large number of firms. But then step by step, economists started to take this literally. And what is even more problematic, economists and policy decision makers, step by step, regulators, legislators, started to look at the markets that had only one or few firms as uncompetitive, monopolistic, and to use this model as a benchmark for competition. If you don't have a large number of firms, if your structure of market structure is too concentrated, that meant that the market was uncompetitive. So they devised an entire statistical apparatus how to estimate to what degree market was concentrated. So what is concentration? Is actually how powerful a single individual firm is within a given market. You will remember that the ideal of a perfectly competitive market is that every single individual firm is infinitely small. You cannot influence the market as one individual firm one bit. Now they devised a statistical measure called concentration ratio. And what concentration ratio was, you take 3 largest firms, for example. And you add up their revenue, their sales figures, how many units they sell. And you get to a certain number X. And you look then at the entire industry and add up the sales figures, the total revenue of the whole industry. Let's call that Y. So this is Y is total sales for the whole industry. And you then divide X over Y, concentration ratio. So bigger this R, concentration ratio, less competitive the market is, which means that the largest 3 firms control a larger share of the market. If it's 30%, that's better than 50%, but if even better would have been 15%. So concentration ratio is a mathematical relationship between the sales figures of an arbitrarily chosen elite or a few largest firms, typically 3 or 5 largest firms, depending on the structure of the market, and the total sales figures for the entire industry. And for a very long period of time, this test, the concentration ratio of an industry, was used as the main benchmark for antitrust policy. Antitrust policy. Anyone knows what is antitrust? Anyone heard about antitrust? That's a federal law in the United States, or a set of federal laws, that are used to control or restrain the monopolies, to secure free competition. The first one was enacted in 1890. It's called Sherman Antitrust Act. And there are a variety of others, you don't have to bother now. The Clayton Act of 1914 and Robinson-Putnam Act in 1930s. There are a variety of them, of federal laws, and all of them in a different way, in a different fashion, regulate big business and try to restrain bad monopolistic behavior by large firms and to secure competitive conditions on the markets. For a very long period of time, this structuralist view of structuralist understanding of monopoly was dominant. So, if in a particular industry the largest firm controlled 50 or 60% of the market, that was an automatic call to the government to do something about this one. Typically, you know, what was the, and it is still advocated by some politicians, one of the most frequently used antitrust policies to deal with monopolists. About too large firm that monopolizes too large a part of the market, what you do? Break it up into smaller pieces. So I can give you one example. The Ford Motor Company, the Henry Ford, said a couple of occasions that Ford could have grown much bigger as a firm, but that they were afraid that the antitrust division of the Department of Justice will penalize them if they ever grow beyond 3% of the market, 35%. So they restrain their own economic growth in order not to be persecuted by antitrust or anti-monopoly laws in the United States. Okay, so this was the role, and the main culprit here, the main theoretical justification for believing this thing, believing that concentration ratio should lead antitrust policy, was perfectly competitive model. The idea was that you have as many small firms, and if you don't have very large number of small firms, something is fishy, something is problematic, something has to be done about the competitive conditions. Now, in reality, actual behavior of firms in competitive markets as well as in monopolistic markets departs sharply from the model of perfect competition. So we know that the firms, can you give me a few examples that pretty much all, most firms that you know do that are forbidden in a perfectly competitive model, in a price-taking model? Some kind of economic actions that firms routinely engage in that are not possible in the price-taker model. Anyone? Sir? Advertising. Okay, very good. Advertising. Why real firms in the real world have to advertise, whereas perfectly competitive firms do not have to advertise? We discussed this last time. So why firms in the real world very often have to advertise their products? Yeah, they need to inform the consumers of their existence, to convince them to their product, to offer the information about their own existence, about the existence of their products, and about the characteristics of the products. So information is not perfect, contrary to the assumptions of perfectly competitive model. What else? You go down the list of perfectly competitive marketing, you will see that many of the conditions are routinely violated in the real world.
Homogeneous products.
Yeah, homogeneous products. So how is that violated in the real world? Yeah, differentiation of products. What about prices? Price competition. So this is competition through quality here. And we have also price competition. Price cutting. Price discounts. So underselling the competition could be a competitive strategy, and very often it is. So now you think to yourself, right, if this is so plainly and painfully obvious that this could not be a realistic description of real world competition, how on earth economists ended up insisting on one of the maybe least realistic assumptions of the model, large number of firms? That's a good question. Sometimes economists are prone to superstitions, just as everybody else. There is one reason that you can kind of indirect, not maybe justification, but explanation for this, that usually in the real world we associate, in the everyday experience, we associate competitiveness of a market with the existence of multiple suppliers, multiple sellers, multiple competing producers. So in a certain sense, you can say that this is a commonsensical mistake, commonsensical errors that economists have made. Okay, but the assumption of all of this, price competition, quality competition, advertising, and so on, the assumption here is that what the firms want to do is to compete, honestly. They can compete in different ways, but the idea is to maximize your profit by serving consumers better than anybody else. We can quarrel or we can debate about what is the proper model to think about the process, what is the proper description of the process, but we always agree that the final goal is to serve consumers better than the opposition. However, there is another powerful idea here, or one important economic problem here. What if there are few firms and they, instead of competing, they try to manipulate the market. They try to collude together, to conspire against the public, and then to sell at higher prices and to reduce production. So that's the idea of subverting market or controlling the market. Controlling the market. So this is the basic idea, which is a justification for all kinds of government policies to protect competition. That the firms, if the market is left to its own devices, you will end up eventually with a few big fish. Firms controlling the market and abusing it to line up their pockets and reap off the consumer. So if you say that the real founding father of this way of thinking was Karl Marx. He said that capitalism had undergone an evolution, a development through a couple of different stages. The early liberal capitalism was a situation where you have a large number of firms. This kind of perfectly competitive market could have described the early stages of the capitalist evolution. And then as capitalism matures, develops further, because of certain reasons, certain economic reasons of efficiency, the ownership concentrates more and more. You have more and more larger firms, or less and less, lower and lower number of larger firms that control a larger part of the market. So then eventually, this inherent natural evolution of the market system will lead you to something called monopolistic capitalism. That's Lenin's steal Lenin's term, in which a few big corporations control the entire market. You see that the ripples of this way of thinking, although Marxism had been completely discredited as an economic theory, at an ethical and philosophical level, the ripples or the remnants of this way of thinking survive to this day. How many of you have heard for the theory that the entire economic system in America is controlled by a few wealthy people and a few big corporations? That's like 70% of journalists and intellectuals believe that and write about that every day, completely unaware that the real source of that misconception is a Marxist economic theory that has been proven to be false in all its main components. So controlling the market, how firms can conspire to control the market. Like a few big firms can conspire to control the market. The most obvious way is something called cartels. Cartels. Cartels are informal associations of a couple of firms that make an implicit agreement to raise prices and to reduce production. So here, cartel shouldn't be understood in this in a popular way, like a Colombian drug cartel or anything like that. No, it's not that. It's an economic structure of the market where you have a few firms. Remember last time when we classified markets by the number of the firms existing in that market. It's called a structure with a large number of firms is called perfect competition. A structure with just one firm is a monopoly, and a structure with a few firms is oligopoly. Cartels emerge when you have an oligopoly, just a few firms, that instead of competing against each other through these ways of advertising, differentiation, price competition, discounts, and so on, instead of competing for consumers, they come together and decide to gang up on consumer and rip him off by higher prices and reduced production. That's a cartel is a malign form of oligopoly. And you can find that cartels, the first plank in Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was that the cartels are prohibited per se. That means you cannot do, if you're caught, for example, agreeing about, like three of us are big firms selling steel, and if anyone catches us negotiating even about charging the same prices, we may end up in jail. It's categorically prohibited to conspire to raise prices together or to reduce production. So cartels, you can say that antitrust laws, anti-monopoly laws prohibit cartels per se. That means no matter what, it's illegal, period. There are some other types of economic behavior that are deemed potentially monopolistic or potentially anti-competitive, but that are not categorically prohibited. Let's see a couple of examples of that. Do you know, I mean, can you guess which kinds of economic transactions could potentially be monopolistic but are not categorically prohibited? Could be allowed, could be prohibited, depending on the assessment made by the government and by the judges. They're subject to approval, to the approval process by the DOJ, Department of Justice. Mergers, horizontal integrations. Two big firms decide, we are three biggest firms in the market, and two of us decide we want to merge into one single firm. So this is not categorically prohibited. Theoretically, we can do it, but there is a complicated process of analysis and determination by the government whether this is going to be allowed. I'll explain maybe in 10 to 15 minutes what are the criteria that they use to allow or to prohibit horizontal integrations of mergers. So cartels are categorically prohibited. Now, there is one catch here with the cartels. Cartels are notoriously inefficient on a genuinely free market. So cartels are inefficient. They tend to be very unstable and to fall apart very quickly if they are not aided by government regulation or by government assistance. So there are 3 or 4 different reasons why cartels as collusions of multiple firms to raise prices and reduce production are inefficient. The first one is the contracts or agreements that we make are notoriously difficult to draw because they have to be complete. They have to cover all eventualities. And the business, the process of production in modern economy is so complex, so complicated that it is very difficult to write a complete contract that will cover all possible problems that may emerge. We decided we're going to raise prices and reduce quantity, negotiations about what will be the market share of every single firm, what will be the process of arbitration if somebody behaves in a fashion that is contrary to the contract, and so on. So the incomplete contracts. Second thing, cartel agreements are illegal. So the risk of doing cartels is very high, even in the common law system. So just to draw one significant distinction here, Sherman Act was passed by American Congress in 1890. That's a written legislation. However, even before Sherman Act was passed, you could not, it was legal to form cartels. You wouldn't end up in jail if you tried to make a cartel. But the catch was that you could not, even in the common law system, you know the difference between common law and legislation? What is the common law? That's a system of judge-created law based on precedent that governs most of criminal proceedings and commercial regulations. So traditional Anglo-Saxon law that dominates still American private law. So in the common law system that evolved over time, cartels could not be legally prohibited, could not be legally enforced to courts. So now you and me make an informal cartel agreement and you cheat on agreement. I cannot sue you in court in order to force you to abide by the stipulations of the agreement. So if you cannot sue your partner for breaking a contract or agreement, that's a very weak agreement, if it's not enforceable by court. Imagine if the wage contract was not enforceable to courts or any other type of debt contract. So these all kinds of agreements, then debt agreements and wage agreements would be very difficult to maintain. There wouldn't be very many of them. So, common law doesn't enforce cartels. You see, there are a variety of obstacles for a successful cartel collusion. The third one is, what is the nature of cartel agreement? The nature is that although we can sell at lower prices, and we can produce more, 3 of us, cartel of 3 or 4 firms, we make an implicit agreement to reduce or to limit our production in order to charge higher prices. Now, What kind of temptations exist for every single individual firm here? You are assigned certain market share, let's say. My firm is biggest, I get 50% of revenue that we earn. He gets 20%, he gets 25%. And all three of us can technologically and economically produce more and sell at lower prices. There is a powerful temptation, particularly for them, for the slightly smaller firms, to cheat on the agreement, to free ride on the agreement, which means to produce more and then illegally, in secret, to offer price discounts to customers, thereby taking over the market share from other members of the cartel. There is a powerful cheating temptation within the cartel. And since we cannot punish cheating and a cartel through courts, then you can get away with cheating very easily on a free market. And you have an economic motivation to cheat because you earn more money and you steal the customers from your buddies. And then I know that you know that you can get away with a cartel cheating, then I will be very likely to, in order to prevent you, to forestall your cheating activity, to cheat myself. So that's the reason why cartels are inherently unstable. Even if they succeed in making an agreement, they tend to fall apart very quickly. And in the 19th century America, there are multiple examples of unsuccessful private cartels that sometimes didn't last as soon as the ink on the paper dried up, as they say, the agreement was kaput. But let's say that we even prevent cheating and we persist in charging higher prices and reducing production. What else can happen? What else can happen is that somebody from the outside can enter the market, compete against us. So our profit rate will increase. You'll remember something that I told you before, that the capital market is very efficient, which means that people are free to move investment from one branch of industry to another. So even if we successfully monopolize the market or cartelize the market, and then we're milking out the consumers and charging higher prices, that means that we are increasing profit rates. And other people see that we increase profit rates, and now there is a powerful incentive for other people to invest in this industry because the profits are better. So new competitors will be much more likely to show up, to appear, if we succeed in creating and maintaining a cartel. A fourth or fifth firms will show up, and they will produce and sell at lower prices, and they will be taking over our consumers, our customers. So outside competition is an additional objective. To any free market cartel. If there are no legal barriers to entry, of course, if the government doesn't make it impossible or difficult for outside competition to enter the market. Now, throughout history, the only successful cartels and the only successful free market monopolies in the long run were those that were guaranteed or protected or aided by the government regulations. And you have many examples of that in a modern society. Do you know an example of a successful government helped cartel in America? Doesn't have to be a collection of firms. It could be a collection of different professionals or individuals. You know, any legislative, any form of legislation that routinely creates cartels, which is supported by a large section of the voting public. Any ideas? Are there any cartels in healthcare industry, medicine? Okay, how are they cartelized by the government? Okay, you mean their patents are protected by law? Yeah, that could be one example. So you limit the competition by protecting the products made by a single firm, but that would be more like a government protecting a monopolistic privilege by the firm. My patent, I created the medicine, and then government gives me exclusive right to sell this product in the next 8 years, and I charge 10 times more than a generic drug would cost. What about doctors themselves? So you go to Harvard Medical School, you complete it, and you automatically start working in a major hospital. Wrong. You have to undergo some additional procedure. Here it's called medical certification or licensure. So professional licensure is a very powerful source of cartelization of given markets, which means limiting potential competition to the providers of certain services. So you erect obligation in addition to regular market attestation that every single hospital would ask for. Have you finished medical school, medical licensure, which can take years sometimes. If you're a foreign worker, medicine can take literal years. You have some examples in your book. So from medicine, where the supply of doctors is artificially kept low by the high requirements of medical licensure, you have barber shops. These ideas, all kinds of justification provided for limiting the supply of sellers of certain goods and services in order to increase the income of a cartel, of people who are within the system. My wife has changed career into medical coding, and she got the test. She actually passed the exam to become a medical coder, but that's not enough now. You have to undergo a certain level of training every 6 months and to pay a certain fee to the Association of Medical Coders, which is not negligible amount of money, every 6 months in order to maintain your status. If you don't do so, you lose your license to do the work, even if you're perfectly competent to perform the service, you cannot do it. So that limits the potential supply of medical coders, but increases the incomes of medical coders who are within the system. So, ever wondered why it is very difficult for foreign doctors to get licensed in the United States? It can take years. It's very simple when you look from an economic point of view. It's a cartel. The American Medical Association is a cartel of doctors who are of American doctors, and they want to limit the competition from the outside of the market. If you allowed every Indian or Eastern European or wherever Latin American doctor studied at a good university in those countries to practice medicine, you would have increased the supply of doctors. This is the equilibrium price of medical services that they can charge now. This is the equilibrium quantity of services. If you increase supply so easily, supply curve will shift here, and you will have a larger quantity of services being provided, more people working, but at a lower price. And these people who are within the system do not like to see the prices of their services going down, so they do everything that they can to limit the new entrants into the market. And now it's always, when you have these sinister protectionist schemes to create or maintain the cartels, it's always in public interest. It's always, no, we want actually to protect public against the uncertified, problematic providers of services. So everybody does it. Plumbers, you have the examples, all plumbers must spend a minimum of 140 hours a year for 5 years, learning higher mathematics, physics, hydraulics, and isometric drawing, for something that has nothing to do with their immediate object of work, but functions very well as a way of limiting the number of people who will be entering into the business. So a typical gambit, a typical justification for medical licensure is that you don't want unqualified people to perform medical procedures. Health is too important to be left alone to uncontrolled market competition. And you can, the most sinister and the most efficient combinations against the public are those in which people who profit from protectionist schemes can instrumentalize and use the well-meaning idealistic proponents of social justice or ethics and so on to work for them. So here you have a group that benefits clearly economically by excluding competition. And this group appeals to common sense or ethical judgment and altruism of the majority that doesn't know economics very well and doesn't know the conditions of the market to support medical licensure. Of course, we want. We don't want incompetent barbers who's going to cut off your ear if they make your haircut, if they do your haircut. So this is the very common combination, anti-competitive cabal, you can say, cabal, a combination of the well-meaning idealists who think or honestly believe that the market is insecure, that we need a government regulation, and cynical people who economically benefit from that. There is one economist that developed a model to describe this kind of behavior. It's called Bruce Yandel, and he called this model a bootleggers and Baptist model. So why bootleggers and Baptists? Bootleggers, because in the American South, they were prohibiting alcohol on Sundays. Baptists were, for religious reasons, prohibiting alcohol on Sunday. And they were haranguing politically and running for office on the platform of shutting down selling alcohol on Sundays and so on. And bootleggers were actually financing and supporting them. Why? Because on Sunday, then the demand for alcohol is here, human nature being what it is. If you cannot buy alcohol regularly, you're going to turn to bootleggers for illegal alcohol. So for their business, it's very good that these idiots, in their view, want to shut down everything on Sunday, and we're going to profit economically. So then we're going to support them electorally. Bootleggers, like criminals, are going to support pious Baptists for local legislature, not because they believe in that nonsense, but because they think they can profit from it. So have these kinds of unholy alliances between cynical profit-seeking interest groups and idealistic preachers of virtue working together against the public. You have similar kinds of combinations of climate change, global warming coalitions. You have idealistic environmentalist activists who want to save the planet and who will support anything to save the planet out of pureness of their heart and their well-meaning motivations. And you have business firms who are going to profit from from the restrictions on CO2 emissions, like renewable industries, wind, solar, nuclear, and so on. All kinds of business interests who will then use those as useful idiots, as communists are calling them, to profit financially on that. So you see, it's not always easy to restrict competition by saying, I want more money. I want to rip off the consumer. It's not really a grabber politically. But if you can find a sympathetic, publicly spirited group that will justify the policies that benefit you of restricting competition on some humanitarian or altruistic grounds, that's a much better proposition for you. So these types of restrictions on competition, like licensure and healthcare regulations, even protectionism sometimes. So how is protectionism justified? On an ethical basis. So we don't say, oh, we want steel and aluminum companies to earn more money by restricting foreign imports. No, we say we want to save American jobs in aluminum and steel industries. So it's always public interest justification of selfish private interest. 99% of limitations and restrictions of free competition is always like that, almost always like that. Private interests using public interest language as a fig leaf for their own ambitions. One of the main, by the way, any questions thus far? One of the main theoretical concepts that is routinely used to intervene in the competitive process is that the big firms are selling below cost. Selling below cost. And this has its reflection in the antitrust policy, where something called predatory pricing is always penalized. Selling below cost, predatory price. And in many local governments, you have laws against this selling below cost, although the concept is eminently unclear or even nonsensical. What does it mean to say below cost? It implies actually that the cost of production determines the price at which you sell. So the basic idea is actually that the predatory firms were selling at artificially low prices so as to eliminate, to drive out the smaller competitors of the market. And once they succeed in doing so, then to charge higher prices and dominate the market. Now, we will see that that's impossible in a moment. It's very unlikely to happen. It never happened in reality. You can look at the American economic history in the last 200 years. You cannot find a single successful example of predatory pricing, that some firm would be selling at artificially low prices only to hurt and financially destroy its smaller competitors, and once it succeeds in doing so, to charge artificially high prices. That's a classical example of this was a usual let's say claim or accusation is routinely being made even in modern textbooks that the John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil was engaging in predatory price cutting. So they would typically cut their prices to hurt the small competitors and then buy them out and increase their empire. And step by step, destroy all competition and create their own economic empire, which they would control 80% or 90% of the oil market in the late 90s. That's a classical case. Now, the only problem with this is that this process was going on for like 3 years, and throughout this process, the price of oil and all of the products that Standard Oil have been making were going down and down and down all the time. They reduced by 70, 80% the cost of production and the price of kerosene and gasoline. So now, maybe they destroyed competitors, but they obviously didn't destroy competition itself. Now, what do you think? Why was John D. Rockefeller stupid? He destroyed all competition, and then for 20 years he kept just cutting prices and increasing production. Contrary to what we expect from a textbook model of a monopoly or a cartel, we expect them to charge higher prices and to reduce production. See the vertical demand curve, monopolistic demand curve, like this. So you expect them to increase prices. They can earn money, they can maximize their revenue by, you see that the drop in the quantity that they charge will be far lower than the increase in price that they charge. So then if John D. Rockefeller was a monopolist, his demand curve was at least this vertical. Why on earth would he refrain from charging higher prices? What do you think? Obviously, he was not a stupid guy. He was the wealthiest guy, one of the wealthiest men in the late 19th, 20th century. Extremely sophisticated investor. Yeah. It's an extremely competitive market. Even with the high financial costs of entry, but very low legal cost of entry. So everybody could enter the oil market. So eventually, you know when and how Standard Oil lost its market share. It happened in 1910s and 1920s. Irrespective of any government action against Standard Oil. Standard Oil was #1 producer and seller of kerosene. However, when gasoline started coming online, the Texas Southwestern firms were much better in doing it, Texaco and others, and they started taking over the market from Standard Oil could not compete so easily against Texaco and Texas oil magnates. It is market forces that eventually have undermined the monopolistic position of Standard Oil. That's exactly what he was afraid of. He was behaving throughout this period, 1875 to 1905, 1910, as the real competitors existed. In order to prevent, to weaken this invitation to potential competitors to enter the market, he was increasing efficiency and lowering prices. Eventually, creative destruction undermined his monopolistic position, that the gasoline was a new product, that Standard Oil was not as good in producing as new firms, and they had taken over a large part of the market. They lost very quickly, in like 5 to 10 years, they lost 70% of the market. So there is nothing more efficient in undermining cartels and monopolies than free competition, and there is nothing as powerful as a weapon of maintaining and freezing them as government supervision and help. Okay, we have time for a few more antitrust concepts of antitrust regulation or antitrust intervention by government. You've seen that cartel prohibition is one of them. Predatory price cutting is one category of antitrust law that is penalized. There is one more maybe crucial category of government regulation of competitive process. That's called merger control. Merger control. Or control of business integrations, which means that two or more firms unite together into one single firm. We've seen already that. Traditionally, this was considered to be very bad. I would say until 1960s, in general, government was very reluctant to approve any new business integration. Exactly because they believe that the new integration will create a more concentrated market. A more concentrated market is bad for business. It's bad for competition. However, since 1960s, a more sophisticated approach was adopted that recognized that there are benefits, not only the costs of integrations, that there are benefits as well. So yes, there is a greater temptation for a single individual firm to charge higher prices if it controls a larger part of the market. That's correct. This is called market power, your ability to charge higher prices regardless of what your competition does. But there are also benefits of larger firms, which is economies of scale. A larger firm can afford to produce at lower costs and to sell at lower prices than a small firm. We've seen that. Walmart sells at much lower prices than mom and pop shops. You cannot, small craft shops cannot compete with General Motors or wherever. So there is a economic benefit of size. It's called economies of scale. Larger the volume of production that you have, lower per unit costs of production. Now, if you understand this, then you're facing a trade-off here as a government. On the one hand, you have benefits of economies of scale, that a bigger firm could be good for the economy by having the ability to produce at cheaper price. On the other hand, it's bad for the economy because these big firms then can afford to charge higher prices because there is less competition. And in so-called horizontal integrations, you know what are horizontal integrations? There are two types of integrations, horizontal and vertical. The difference is that vertical integrations are integrations within one single production process. Our friend John D. Rockefeller was a discoverer and the greatest champion of vertical integration. I told you already about that, I think, that he integrated together into one single business concern, oil drilling, refinery business, and distribution of oil. Before him, the prevailing business model was that one firm would be drilling oil, another would be refining, and the third system would be distributing oil. Okay. Standard Oil of Ohio united all three into one business operation. Traditionally, this was considered to be efficient. These business vertical integrations, the antitrust authorities were very willing to approve of vertical integrations. However, they were much more skeptical about horizontal integrations. What are horizontal integrations? What do you think? If vertical is integrating a single production process, what would be horizontal? Yeah, multiple firms at one stage of production, like the distribution networks. That's horizontal. The firms in the same line of business. The firms in the same business, that would be horizontal integration. There was one horizontal integration that was approved in the United States last year, I think, or a year before that. Bayer Leverkusen, the major pharmaceutical company in Europe, both Monsanto, the largest American pharmaceutical. So that was acquisition technically. So Bayer just swallowed up Monsanto. It was not integration, but it was not merger, but it was integration anyway. So that's a horizontal integration. Bayer Leverkusen deals in pharmaceuticals. Monsanto is also pharmaceuticals and agricultural products and so on. The two firms in the same line of work, the same line of business. And here the criterion for whether you are going to approve of horizontal merger or horizontal integration or not is your estimate whether the costs will exceed benefits in the future, which means whether the risk of these larger firms charging higher prices because it is too powerful and controls the market will be greater than the benefits of this firm having greater productive efficiency, ability to sell at lower prices because of the economies of scale. Now, you see that one fishy thing here is that what is the problem with this? You have to approve beforehand. You have to approve in advance as a government authority a horizontal merger. And your criterion is just what I just described. What is the problem with that? You're making guesses or estimates about something that will happen in the future. As a judge or as an antitrust bureaucrat, you don't know what would have happened in the case the firms did not merge and compare that with what would have happened if they merged. It's a kind of subjective estimate about the superior efficiency of one big firm in the future and two firms unintegrated in the future. So there is a level of subjective discretionary power here which is not based on any objective principles. You can make a mistake. If you knew better than the market which combination of resources is more efficient, you should then buy them up and invest. We don't need market if judges can predict future economic course of events better than the market. Why would we need then private property and the market? So that's one of the difficulties of these horizontal integration policies that is routinely used by all modern civilized governments. Vertical integration, just one more thing before we adjourn. There are some types of economic behavior pertaining to vertical relationships, typically between a manufacturer and retailer of a certain product, that are controversial in antitrust policy. That the governments routinely penalize or tend to look unfavorably to these practices as limitations of competition. It's called resale price maintenance. That means I'm a manufacturer of something, you're my retailer. And I require by contract every one of you to not to sell the product below a certain minimum level. And this looks like a conspiracy against the public. We are making a kind of cartel-like agreement. It's not just the only difference is not a cartel among the firms operating in the same line of business, but a kind of vertical cartel. You're accepting not to sell wherever I'm producing computers or TV sets, and you are a retailer, and you sign a contract saying, I'm not going to sell it cheaper than such and such. And seemingly justification for outlawing these kinds of practices, so maintaining the resale price at a certain level, that's the agreement, seems like anti-competitive behavior. However, when you analyze it economically, you see that it makes a lot of sense economically, because when the nature of the good or service is such that it requires for a successful selling or successful transaction to be completed, cooperation of the retailer, for example, education of the customer, or explaining how the device works. If you can increase sales by using a retailer as your agent your sales agent, in a certain sense, who will help customer and convince customer to buy and train customer how to use the service. Then you're expecting a retailer to function in a certain limited sense as a department of your own firm. So now, what's going to happen? You have multiple retailers who are selling your product. If you abolish this minimum price and everybody is allowed to sell at whichever price they want, then the incentive for a firm to engage in this kind of training customers or helping the manufacturer would have disappeared. Then the firms that decide to train the customers would have been penalized because other firms would then free ride on that. They can take over the market by simply waiting for customers to be trained to knowledge about how to use this product spread among the population, and thereby they would free ride on the activities, useful activities of some isolated retailers. So in order to prevent this, then the manufacturers will be losing, and the money they require everybody to keep some minimal prices that would motivate then everybody to do this task. Okay, we're almost out of time. Just one more thing for you, read. I will post it. That's hilarious. One of the most hilarious examples of protectionism, of this self-interested justification of protectionism. Or you can Google it. You can Google it. Candle makers petition. Frederick Bastiat, economist Frederick Bastiat. B-A-S-T-I-A-T. Candle makers petition. It is mentioned in your book, but read the whole thing. The guy who is writing a petition to the government to ban, to protect candle makers, to protect the producers of candles, and he has an original product how to do so. So read that. Anyone read the candle makers petition? So read it for next time. I will post the homework assignment for you. It will be mostly based on chapter 9, the lecture that we had last time, plus chapter 9. Chapter 9 is the only reading for the homework. Any questions? Okay, then see you all next week.